Thank you for tuning in. This is a recording of an event that took place on June 21st, 2023, sponsored by historic Chevy Chase DC. In the video, HCCDC President Carl Lankowski and Dr. Linda Mann of the African American Redress Network discuss what repair looks like, a survey of community actions to address the legacy of racism. The video is about 55 minutes long. If you're interested to learn more about the project of which this video is a part, please look at our website, www.historicchevychasedc.org. The video begins with Carl Lankowski.
And welcome everybody tonight. We're going to engage in a very loosely structured conversation and presentation tonight about what comes next in our racial justice agenda here in Chevy Chase DC. This event is the third in a series of four that we've launched earlier this year. The first was a book talk for Tory and Green's book, Between Freedom and Equality, about the Pointer family and their descendants who ended up on Broad Branch Road. The second event was the one that we held 2 weeks ago now, I guess it was, on the 7th of June. And that was an encounter with the actual descendants of Black Broad Branch with our neighborhood and anybody else who cared to be present. This event is the follow-on event to that event. And here we're interested in beginning to answer the question, at least, or address the question, so what? What comes next? And now that we know the story and we've met the people that are involved with Black Broad Branch, the question is, and we know what the injustices were and how some of the descendants are feeling about that. The question is, what can we do, and what does repair mean? So we'll be asking questions related to that. And the fourth event, by the way, is coming out in October, and that will be a celebration of the 250th anniversary of the birth of George Pointer, who, of course, as everybody here probably knows, was born in 1773, enslaved, bought his freedom, and then rose to become the superintendent engineer of the C&O Canal before his descendants moved to Broad Branch Road. As it turns out, the question of repair is much on the agenda, not only of us here in our corner of DC, but the DC Council itself had a set of hearings that were organized by the staff of Councilmember at Large Kenyon McDuffie last week, and it was a fantastic, very well prepared and broad, comprehensive overview. And so, in a sense, it acts as a preface to what we're doing tonight. And I'm very pleased that we have as our interlocutor Dr. Linda Mann, who is the co-founder and the research director of the African American Redress Network. So I've asked Linda to help us think through and about what repair actually means, what the dimensionality of it is, what organizations do we have that can help us understand more about what the repair process might look like, what has been already attempted in terms of initiatives around the country, and any other questions that come to mind in the short hour that we have this evening. So I'll turn things over to Linda, who will make a brief presentation, and then we'll take your questions. Linda, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. I'm sorry. Am I lagging at all? Because I'm having a little bit of a delay with the Zoom. Is everybody able to hear and see me in time? Or am I?
You're coming through loud and clear, Linda.
Okay, terrific. Love the thumbs up. All right, great. So I'm laughing about Carl saying that it's going to be a brief presentation. I'm going to do my very best to be brief. But I really think it's good for me to give you a context of this work in the United States, because there's oftentimes a sentiment that this work is not something that needs to happen in the United States, that this history is long ago, we don't really need to attend to it. And so I'm going to address some of those questions by giving you some background on the work that is being done in the United States and how it situates within the global context. So I'm going to share my screen here and make sure I have the right, give me 1 second and make sure that I am sharing the correct PowerPoint. Here we are. Okay. So let me just go and put this on. Give me 1 second. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is I will just specifically speak to you about the African American Redress Network and give you a little bit of an overview as to our organization, a brief chronology of U.S. historical injustices. I will also give you a little bit of an overview of the national and global efforts to respond to racial injustices, and then what's the responsibility. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of difficulties with my screen, and I apologize. I may have to just show you step by step because for some reason it's lagging. And then we'll look specifically at efforts in the United States since the 1990s. And then we will talk about specific local levels and how they are going about responding to historical injustices. Okay, I'm still going to try to do my best here. Bear with me. I think we're having a little bit of technical difficulties. My apologies. Can you all see the slides, or are they okay? Or are they just notes? Like, that's what I'm worried about. Are you seeing the slide itself?
We're seeing the slide and a couple around it, but we're not seeing the notes.
Okay. I don't know why it's working wrong, but that's okay. Okay, so the African American Redress Network is a collaboration between Howard University and Columbia University. The work that we do, we work specifically in local communities. We work on performing collaborative research, legal advocacy, and capacity building for communities that are dealing with racial injustice and trying to look at forms of repair. And our organization was structured to actually decolonize the academy, we like to say. Our steering committee has equal representation of local and descendant communities. And Columbia's stance is to take the lead on redress by placing the voices of African American communities and descendants of Africa at the forefront of our work. So hence, we are a collaboration between Columbia and Howard University. So in reality, the United States has been reluctant to respond to the history of enslavement, historical racial terror and oppression, and other crimes against humanity toward African Americans and descendants. This remains truthfully an unsolved human rights battle. There have been significant attempts to reckon for this past, including reparations and human rights campaigns. And if you can see on this slide, post-slavery large-scale reparations were really promoted in the United States. Of course, many of us are familiar with Sherman's Special Field Order. There was the 1969 Black Manifesto and the National Emancipation Proclamation Centennial Observance Committee that was championed by Audley Moore in the 1969. And then there has been the efforts with HR 40 and John Conyers starting in 1989 and continuing on to today. Sheila Jackson Lee from Texas took it over when Conyers left Congress. But this is not just a US oriented effort to reconcile this past. This is actually a global conversation. The failure for the US to address these historical crimes against humanity have intensified actually since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights after World War II. There was an effort for the US to respond with the UN ratification on the Convention of the Prevention and Punishment of Crimes of Genocide. There was a Civil Rights Congress. The United States, there was a charge, we charged genocide in 1951 against the United States government. And the UN General Assembly adopted the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination in 1969. So these have been ongoing. Actually interesting that a Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination in March 2008 blasted the US for its two-tiered society. And so here are some of the human rights infractions that have been basically charged against the US that we haven't responded to. Now, you might say to me, well, reparations, though, those are usually for, like you said, the declaration post World War II and reparations for the Holocaust or South Africa and apartheid. Or you might say to me the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. And while that's partially true, that is not necessarily the case. There have been and are continuing to be increases in responses to the legacies of systemic injustices. And just here are two examples that have happened in the last decade. We have Canada with the reckoning and reparations that happened just this past year, in which they passed cash reparations and education oriented practices for Canada, and then the Commission in Australia and reparations, compensatory reparations for First Nations in Australia. So what is it that most of these, why bother years later? What is it about this that is being remedied? And basically the systemic injustice has resulted in significant disparities within these communities that have been oppressed over time. And here I give you just some data points in which you can see up here in the upper left, the white versus Black and Hispanic, even growing past the Black and white disparities, homeownership, financial disparities, the school to prison pipeline is a huge issue, education, death rates, birth rates, etc. So what happens when a government doesn't respond? What you see here is a little bit of a study that was done in the University of Maryland in which they began to look at that question. And what happens is what's happened in the United States. You begin to have local and state level efforts to respond to these histories because communities are so impacted by the long-term systemic racism and the systemic injustices that communities either A, are recognizing their role in these, or B, the communities themselves are still fighting for justice and advocating for their communities to have repair. So this slide is in 2019. We began to take a look at actually what was happening across the United States. We did a 3-year mapping project and we mapped over 460 efforts in the United States of local and state level reparations happening. We took apart each section of the United States and looked at historical errors to determine exactly what was happening region by region across the United States. And this is going to be the context of our big conversation tonight, and position these framed within the international human rights framework. So the international human rights framework allows for you to look at a multifaceted approach to pathways for repair. It allows for communities to look at different ways, compensation being one of them, but there are other modes of reparations within the international human rights framework. There can be rehabilitation, which can be physical and psychological care. There can be satisfaction, which is an apology, a name change to a street, a name change to a school. Restitution can be things like giving back land, like we saw in Bruce's Beach in California. And guarantees of non-repetition tend to be focused on actually changing systems. So I would say the way that the Redress Network works, we are one of those forms of non-repetition. None of the funds that we acquire go into the university. Instead, they go directly to the descendant community, and we infuse the descendant community with economic wellness by supporting them in their repair initiatives as well. I can tell you that we are on the uptick. I mean, there is just a significant increase in entries across the United States. It continues to grow. I think just in the last 18 months, we've identified another 90 efforts across the country. And as we know from California, the state itself is looking at reparations. They are preparing actually to come out with what we understand is 149 recommendations for the state. And they are also going to announce those on 2019. So I encourage you to please watch the news, because that's going to be big. You also know New York just passed the similar reparation commission to be created for the state of New York. We actually can tell you that across the country, at least when with these graphs, which stopped in 2021, and we're again revising them right now, the majority of the responses within communities and states was satisfaction. The second was guarantees of non-repetition and compensation. The number one historical wrong that was being addressed was enslavement, followed by segregation, and then many of the Jim Crow era human rights infractions such as lynchings and massacres. But again, they span all sorts of historical injustices, including land loss, as you've experienced in your own Black Broad Branch. Here just gives you a little bit overview of the United States in general. You can see it differs compared in region to region, and I can talk to you a little bit more about that when we look at some specific case studies. But regardless, across the United States, efforts are occurring. Here again, we can tease out data. We could tell you what's happening specifically in the Mid-Atlantic. This happens to be a slide on West North Central, and you can get a sense of what's happening within the states and also the specific types of reparations that are being forwarded and what are they responding to. Compensatory reparations are being led by faith-based organizations. As you can see here, the list of different states and different types of faith-based organizations, but states are also forwarding reparations, compensatory reparations, as well as universities and municipalities. Here's a list of, I was saying to you, we've got about 90 that we haven't mapped out yet on our website, but here's a list of some of the newest city ordinances and state laws that have come in the most recent decade. So you have a situation in which, I would say is very similar to the work that we do. We work alongside communities that invite us in to sit down and talk about what repair might look like with those community members. We've done this in many different municipalities. And we take a very community-based, descendant focused effort in which we work, again, like I said, alongside them. The process for assessing reparative justice in these communities is threefold. And again, I know you've done a lot of this. We do a very deep dive in the historical analysis, and then we use the social determinants of health to understand actually the actual impact to the communities, to the descendant communities. What has been the impact? And we use the social determinants of health that was established by the World Health Organization in 2005, because it gives you a very comprehensive look at the harms. You can look at education, you can look at economics, you can look at the neighborhood, you can look at education. And then from those, we work alongside the communities to develop reparations or repair initiatives. So we were involved in Evanston, and Evanston was very pointed. In 1919 to 1920, there was a policy that was passed that was purposeful to segregate the Black and Brown community within Ward 8. And that was specifically designed to keep what they considered blight segregated. Most of the individuals that were impacted by that policy remain in that ward to today. And we were able to actually trace those communities, take a look at the wealth gap, take a look at the home, look at the analysis of their home and their wealth within, even if they even owned a home. And we're able to also look at education outcomes and healthcare outcomes, because this part of the community was purposefully disinvested and was zoned commercial and industrial, which led to significant environmental impacts as well. From that, the reparations conversations included town halls, which were led by former Alderwoman Robin Ruth Simmons, who now leads First Repair. And those town meetings with the descendants determined what the repair would look like. And for them, it was compensatory and it was reparations to provide money towards home repair or towards the purchase of a first-time homeowner. We've been involved in Africatown, Alabama, which is a completely different example, and that's why I brought it to you tonight. But Africatown is in the Deep South. And for those of you who haven't watched Descendant on Netflix, I encourage you to watch. But Africatown was one of the last, well, it's the last known enslaved ship that arrived to the United States in 1860. This was 58 years after enslavement, transatlantic enslaved practices was made illegal. It was done by a bet by a man named Timothy Mayer, who believed that he could get away with not being federally extradited for his for doing a federal offense, and he did get away with it. But this was only 5 years before emancipation, and so this community actually ended up founding their own community known as Africatown, Alabama. What's unique about this is this community remained self-governed, completely void of any impact from Mobile County or the state of Alabama, completely self-governed for 100 years. In 1960, they finally decided to incorporate with Mobile County only to get water and sewage services. And that was a decision that ended up resulting in the most significant environmental injustices imaginable. The community became bifurcated by two highways. They brought in paper mill, oil barges, and the population of the community decreased by 80%. 80%. You can't even grow plants in the soil. It is so toxic. Cancer rates are 3 times that of neighboring communities in Mobile. So we've been working with them, completely different reparative approach. They don't have the support of the government, although that is growing, it's improving. And so they wanted to do a reparative process from the bottom up. And we worked alongside them to reignite a historical cultural event that was held until 1952 called the Africatown Lantern Walk. And that process actually has infused the community, not only economically, but culturally. It's brought the community together. It's provided the school education opportunities. It's provided community businesses opportunities to engage through transportation. The churches are all involved. And so that was a completely different type of reparative justice versus that experienced in Evanston. So I will stop there. That's just a tiny little glimpse of some of the stuff that's happening across the United States. This is definitely on the uptick, and I congratulate you for being at the forefront of the work.
Thank you very much for that, Linda. There's so much that we could begin to ask about it. I know we have people that are with us today that have also were at the hearings last week, and I'm wondering. I don't see any questions so far. Maybe they're in the chat. No, not yet. I mean, you did give an overview of the various dimensions of, but it was very fleeting, and I'm wondering if you can remind us about the global, the UN defined dimensions again about this. Where does repair come from? How is it defined at the international level?
You're muted, Linda.
Yeah, I'm going to show you this slide because this slide everybody loves. And this slide really is a summary of a writing that was developed by the International Commission of Jurists. The International Commission of Jurists is a group of lawyers, international lawyers and judges, and that are really deeply involved in human rights. And when I kind of fast-tracked over those different international efforts in which racial justice has tried to be attended to, one of the things that's important is in all of those documentations, the right to repair is evident in every single one of those documentations. So the International Commission of Jurists developed the 5 categories of repair, and they're listed here. The 5 categories of repair provide, as I said, a multifaceted approach to respond to repair, because one of the things that's really important to understand is that repair is not just compensatory. I mean, what we're really talking about is repairing racial rifts and remedying communities to be more whole. And the research actually shows that, like, some of the most important things there that can be done is acknowledgement. This field of satisfaction right here, acknowledgement and an apology for these harms is one of the most important steps forward. I know that you have done commemoration and memorialization. Truth-telling truth-telling commissions is also a part of that. I would say that one of the other areas that's incredibly common in the guarantees of non-repetition, if you remember, that was the second on that graph I showed you very quickly, that was the second most popular. And I think that's because a lot of communities are engaging in education, in the reorienting of education to provide a more full understanding of the history, both the good and the bad of U.S. history, and acknowledging these harms and talking about the difficult things that happen in communities. So guarantees of non-repetition can come in the form of education. The other area, of course, is, that we're seeing a lot is compensatory, and compensatory is not always a direct pay. It's interesting to note, though, now that Evanston has not only provided reparations in the form of housing, but is now actually doing direct pay. But compensatory, most commonly prior to Evanston, was in the form of scholarships. And that was a very common way. If we talked about Rosewood, Florida, so Rosewood, Florida was a site where it was part of the Red Summer. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Red Summer, that was a time in the United States that was full of significant racial terror, led by the government, in which communities were literally, in some areas like Tulsa, as we know, were bombed by the government itself. Rosewood was one of those sites that experienced racial terror and massacre, and the community was completely annihilated. In Florida, in the 1990s, they passed the Rosewood compensatory bill that, first of all, acknowledged this history, but then provided reparations in the form of scholarship funds. Another one would be not a far throw from DC, in the Commonwealth of Virginia. This is from a different era, so this would be segregation. Schools were closed in the Commonwealth of Virginia post Brown v. Board and the desegregation of schools as a way to deny desegregation. It was a way to keep schools segregated. And there's a lot of legal things that happened by the Commonwealth to make that happen, but there were 5 localities that literally shut down public education, completely stopped educating, and basically rolled back compensatory education, and then siphoned their money from taxes to pay for white-only schools. One of those communities was Prince Edward County, which is the home of Hampden Sydney, and there's another school there I can't think of right now, but that community ended up pushing for scholarship compensation from the Commonwealth of Virginia, and that was passed in 2005. And just recently, they changed that. It was to go specifically only to those denied the education. It has recently been revised. That bill was revised, and now it's going to the descendants. So those are some ways in which compensatory has happened. I just want to comment quickly, rehabilitation is incredibly important. We've seen some efforts with communities in which they've tried to encourage circles, so racial repair circles, communities that engage in these very difficult conversations. I would say to you, outside of specific efforts, coming to the table is brilliant at doing this kind of work. And then restitution is actual giving back of the land, like Bruce's Beach in California. So I'll stop there. But I think that maybe gives you a little bit more on those 5 categories.
We do actually have a few questions coming on, and maybe I'll just refer them to you. One anonymous attendee says, how do efforts to inhibit or prohibit racial and/or history education affect your efforts, and what do you do in response?
I'm assuming they're talking about things like critical race theory, et cetera. Honestly, we haven't, I would say it depends on the geographic region. My response to that is it depends on the geographic region. So like our work in Africatown, very complicated, not a great support system locally. And as a result, those types of communities look for external support. So they go outside of the government or outside of local organizations such as yourself and seek support from allies in external organizations. So that's how that's how they advance the work when there isn't support. I can read some of these. Yes. Okay. So in response to the, from here to equality. Yes. So definitely, Dr. Sandy Darity is very much involved in support of redress. Again, compensatory is a piece of it. I would say that he's very, very much an advocate for HR 40 as well. I will say to you that the research does show that the only way to really attend to the disparities in communities that have been harmed for centuries is reparations, and compensatory reparations being a part of that. It will be interesting to watch California, and I just want to bring this up because California is recommended, at least the last iteration of the draft suggested a tiered reparative compensatory response. So if you could demonstrate that you came from enslavement, you would get a certain amount of compensatory reparations. If you demonstrated you experienced segregation during Jim Crow, there would be a different tier. So there was a tiered approach. We'll see if that's what they end up doing in California.
Yeah. Before
Yeah.
you go further, let me just interpolate another question that comes up in that context. I mean, it's a question of metrics. It may sound a bit technical, but I think there's a larger philosophical point here. If there's damage and the damage is going to be compensated in some way financially, what are the proper metrics? How do you measure this? And then, the follow-on question, of course, is, and how do you find the means to pay for it?
Well, there's always that response, and I know from having worked in this space for a very long time, we don't hesitate to provide significant money for repair in other nations, other than our own. It's I think more of a problem of not wanting to look internal too much. A little bit of American exceptionalism. We can come to the rescue for other countries, but and I can tell you, having worked in many of these countries, in many of these communities, if I close my eyes in some of these communities, I might as well be in South Africa and apartheid. I mean, there are communities in the United States that still don't have running water, don't have broadband, are literally in war zones as a result of continued disinvestment. So I think I push back against that and say, we come to other countries to restore, but maybe it's okay to take a look at our own and consider how we might go about doing that. That said, I will say to you the 5 categories of repair. The International Commission of Jurists makes a very clear distinction, and I want to raise that up here. And that is that actually to have true reparations, you have to hit all 5 categories. And there's a reason for that. And that is if you provide compensatory reparations, but you don't change the systems, then you don't actually repair the problems that exist, the systemic aspects that exist. So the International Commission of Jurists is very firm on this, and so are a lot of the legacy organizations that have been focused on reparations for ever, like NARC and NCOBRA, who were part of the testimony last week at DC. They agree. You have to have all 5 categories of reparations. I will say to you, in the United States, I only know of 2 sites that have, in my estimation, have had full 5 categories of reparations. But compensatory is only one piece of it. And I think that's what we're going to see with the California reparations suggestions on June 29th, 149 suggested policies and practices.
Yeah. No, I have no reason to question the comprehensive nature of the response. I was just trying to get a sense of how do you figure out what's just when you're just looking at one piece of that. So one thing that was suggested last week in the hearings, for instance, was to close the wealth gap, because the wealth gap is allegedly associated with the legacy of enslavement and Jim Crow and the rest.
Mhm.
And then you have to figure out what the wealth gap is, who qualifies for compensation and whatnot. It's those sorts of questions that they're a little nerdy, but I thought I'd just open that question because it's probably something that others are thinking about too. And when they're
Well,
listening.
I mean, I noticed in your comments, someone asked about genealogy and historians, and the answer is yes, you have to. I mean, that's part of the process, is determining descendants and considering how you respond to the harms once you've identified individuals. I think that's a conversation to have with community members about what that might look like. Certainly the scholarship programs are a way to provide funds for direct descendants, and that's been something that many communities have done. I know that there's a comment in here about returning the land, and I can only say to you that the way that it was done in Bruce's Beach is that the land was given back to the family, and then the town actually rented the land from them. So they were receiving rent for continuing to use the land as a public, well, as not in a public, but as a beach. It ended up in the end that the family sold the beach completely back and took the proceeds that way. So that is one way that land loss has been responded to, as you're saying in here, returning the land.
Yeah. I mean, one of the issues that comes up is how jurisdictions work with each other. And it's not just a horizontal question, it's a vertical question, right? We have a federal system, so we have municipalities, we have states, and then we have the federal level. And not everything could be done at every level. So how do you get, this is an impossible question, of course, but how do you get these things to work together?
It's a really complex process. I'm not going to lie to you. I mean, to have government functions and infrastructures work with community engagement and outreach and public education and policy advocacy, and then also research, and then to try to come up with a form of repair, it's an incredibly complicated process. I'm just not going to sugarcoat it for you. It is. But, I mean, some of the communities, and I think I shared this with you in our conversations, I mean, some of the communities have created coalitions. They work along other side organizations. to come together more of as a community coalition to consider how to advance repair, so that so that one specific organization is not the only organization advancing repair.
There are a whole series of questions now. I mean, one of them that actually comes up in the Q&A is the descendants of dispossessed African Americans who live in Broad Branch at Pointer Park say they wanted their land back. Is that a possibility, or would they accept cash for the current value of the land? Well, you can't know that specifically, but in a general way, what is your sense of how this would work?
I mean, that's as I shared with you how Bruce's Beach was responded to. You could rent it back to the community, to the descendant community. It is a very complicated process, and I think someone said something in here about working with a legal team, and I would say to you that most of those types of cases with land often involve legal counsel.
In your experience, what's the sine qua non for any kind of success? Is it an initiative that comes, say, from a city council? Is it a community group like ours? Is it different in different places? What works?
Each place is so unique, to be honest with you. I mean, we worked in Chicago last year, and we met with about 16 different organizations that were working on repair at the community level. We've worked, most of the time we work specifically with community organizing groups and descendant-led groups. So that's really the bulk of the community efforts that we engage in. If you're talking about passing like municipal and state-led commissions, reparations task force, et cetera, that's a different practice than what you're looking at, which is more of the hyper-local. I think it's important when you're doing the hyper-local, as you are, like I said, I think coalition building is incredibly important, because the reality is at the hyper-local, most of the organizations, first of all, don't have the financial means to do the type of repair that may be required. And secondly, don't have the capacity. And that's just a reality. Whether you're a historic organization such as your own, or you're a descendant-led organization, which are the majority of the groups that we work with, that's just a reality. So I think it's very important to, no matter how you go about doing this, and this is really the core of our work, is that you work alongside the descendant community, and you have hard conversations with them actually about what repair might look like and how that might occur. But coalition building at the local level is, I believe, absolutely essential.
There's a kind of longish question here, which boils down to a summary of what some of the things are we've tried to do here locally, and then raises the question of perhaps the local advisory neighborhood commission will now sponsor a resolution calling on the DC Council to acknowledge improper taking of land and apologize, and perhaps those efforts can lead to compensation and restitution. I would be curious what you think of this approach, as well as other attendees.
I definitely think, listen, I'm a white person in this space, and I don't know of the composition of your organization, but I truly believe that white people need to be speaking on behalf of this. Um, Silence is an action. Um, and I guess that's the best response I could have to that.
Let's see. What do you say to the Harris Pointer descendants who say that justice would be return of their land, period, full stop? Have you worked with lawyers specialized in representation of communities seeking reparative justice? An example is the John Relman of the Relman law firm here in DC. And then there's a citation of the website.
Yeah, I mean, I will say to you that we have dealt with cases that have land loss, but that returning of the land is incredibly complicated and takes a long time. That said, it is doable. There is just a case I should give to you, and I think it's called the Reparations Project. It's out of Georgia, and it's a great story. I actually think they're coming out with a book. And I will try to put that in the chat. But essentially, this woman uncovered that her descendants were enslavers. And through genealogical work, she located the individuals who her family had enslaved, and found out that some of this land that was used for the plantation was tied up, and the descendants could not obtain that land. It's taken them about 3 years, and they now are actually giving the land is being given back to the family. But it's a long process, and there was a lot of legal hurdles in having that done. It's not something that just happens like that.
Tim Hannibal asks, Linda mentioned only 2 examples that she knows of that have met all 5 categories of repair. Can you tell us what those are?
Yeah, and I'm going to put in, here's the reparations project. I think you'll all find this absolutely compelling. Sarah Eisner is an amazing woman, and Randy is the descendant of Randy Quarterman, I believe his name is the descendant of people that her family enslaved. It's an incredible story. So please take a look at that website. Sure. I don't quote me on this because I haven't done a deep dive into the research, but I would say Chicago. Chicago would be one. Chicago passed a reparations ordinance in response to the torture that was done under a police commander, John Burge. And it was pretty significant what he did to Black members who they targeted. And the last remaining piece that they've been wanting to get, they actually passed education curriculum. They did guarantees of non-repetition by working with the police department and changed the way that they did business. They provided compensation. They apologized. The last piece was the memorial, and the memorial is now going in. So they will have hit all 5 categories. And they provided health care for those individuals who were terrorized by the police force and both physical and mental health care. That's one. The other one I actually think would probably be maybe Prince Edward County in Virginia, but that would be by the community's doing, to be honest with you. I wouldn't say that that was the state. The state did participate, but the community itself has made sure that advancements have happened. And when I say the community, I'm talking about the individuals who are denied education and their descendants.
We're getting close to our closing time, and there are a couple of other questions. How do you open the minds of people like the appointer descendants, the forms of reparative justice, other than having their land back, given the unlikelihood of tearing down the Lafayette School, etc.? I think you've answered this in a way, but the idea of reverse rental and so forth.
Yeah, yeah. I will say to you, one of the questions in here, one of the questions that was earlier on was, how do you change people's minds for the public education?
Yeah.
And I would just say to you, the coalition building is huge. Bring together every organization you can think of in your community. I mean, I know when I met you several years ago, or maybe it was a year and a half ago on the land, I talked about your local book clubs, but bring in your book clubs, all of your faith-based organizations. One of the most amazing things that's happened out of Evanston is there is now a 17 congregation coalition in Evanston that is focused on reparations. And I'm talking synagogues, Christian oriented, Muslim oriented. They have 17 congregations all working together to consider what repair might look like and to contribute financially. They're all contributing to the reparations. They have a actual community organization that holds the money and then determines how it is disseminated by the individuals who are harmed. So that's another way. Like, think about maybe creating a repair fund in which the descendant community and maybe a couple members of the community themselves would be part of the overseers to see how that money is disseminated in a way that provides repair.
Well, amen and hallelujah. That's a good way to, and a very practical way to conclude our session tonight. We have run out of time. I want to thank you very much, Dr. Mann, for giving us the opportunity to hear from you. You're doing wonderful work, and I wish there were more of you. And thanks so much for taking the time. I just want to remind everybody that we're taking a little break for the summer. We'll be back in the fall. And put on your schedule the 7th of October, there'll be an event on the Virginia side of the Potomac at Great Falls to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the birth of George Pointer. And with that, I want to bid you all adieu. Linda, again, thank you.
Thank you. I just think it's great. And if there's anything I can do, or you want to invite me to anything, I'd love to come and be a part. And really, I commend everybody for just being here tonight, to be open-minded yourself, and talk to your friends and family.
We will do that. And Chaz, thank you for.
You bet. The recording of this will be up on our website in a couple of days. And so if you want to suggest that other people have a look at the conversation this evening, that will be a way they can join us.